Welcome back. As I said, we are focusing on continental issues for the moment. In September earlier this year, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court appealed against the acquittal of former Ivory Coast leader Laurent Gbagbo. Gbagbo faced 4 counts of crimes against humanity during post-electoral violence in Ivory Coast between December 2010 and April 2011, where Gbagbo refused to accept defeat by rival Alassane Ouattara. Earlier in January, Gbagbo was cleared of crimes against humanity. And joining us now in studio is Mr Bernard Houdin, who's a special advisor to the former Ivory Coast leader Laurent Gbagbo. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
How is Mr Gbagbo doing?
Now Mr Gbagbo is in Brussels. He's waiting, as you said, for the end of the assessment of the appeal. We strongly believe that this kind of appeal cannot go through, and Mr Gbagbo should be in Côte d'Ivoire by the middle of next year, I think. And because Mr Gbagbo is in the middle of the story for Côte d'Ivoire, and we need him for the reconciliation, because the first need of Ivorian is reconciliation.
How do you think he ended up at the ICC in the first instance? He's been acquitted, so the courts have decided he's done nothing wrong. How did he end up there in the first instance then?
You know, I follow all the trial since the very beginning, and I was completely sure, and Mr Gbagbo was sure with me, because I visit him many times in the jail, that he will be acquitted. And because everybody must know that the trial itself was stopped just after the witnesses of the prosecutor. We have not to use the witnesses of the defense. So that means that the case was completely false. And Mr Gbagbo has to be acquitted in January because the case was very bad and very long.
Do you think it was politically motivated then, the case?
It was completely motivated. You know, I wrote a book in French, and in the book I put some emails sent between the prosecutor, Mr Ocampo, and the French government. And we see in these mails that all the prosecution of Mr Gbagbo was tricky. Definitely.
Who was, in your view, behind this political charge against Mr Gbagbo?
Unfortunately, because I'm a French origin,
yes,
it was France. And even Mr Sarkozy. We are all the proofs here on the table. Everybody knows that. So and even Mr Sarkozy said, we install Mr Ouattara. He was not elected. I was in Abidjan for the election time. I can tell you that until my death, I will say Mr Gbagbo won the election. And the result we was gave at the headquarters of Mr Ouattara on Thursday, 2nd of December, was a false number.
So what was his disagreement with France that France took this position?
It's very weird. I cannot, for myself,
yeah,
I cannot understand. I grew up in Côte d'Ivoire.
Yeah.
I'm French, I'm Ivorian. And I think that Côte d'Ivoire and France are very linked. And what some French politicians done for maybe personal reasons, financial reasons, I don't know. But it's against France and against Côte d'Ivoire itself.
What does Mr Gbagbo see in his future? You say he may be home by middle of next year. Will he go back into politics, do you think?
He will not go back into politics because he never left politics. He was even in jail. He was one of the beacon of Côte d'Ivoire. And tomorrow, for the election, and we need to know which kind of election we will have in October 2020, because it's not yet sure that the election will take place with all the tricky game that Mr Ouattara is playing now. And Mr Gbagbo back in Côte d'Ivoire, the first thing is a reconciliation, as I said. You know, today Mr Bédier, the former president, went to visit Mr Gbagbo in Brussels Mr. Soro, the former rebel, will visit Mr. Blegoudé in The Hague. So that means that today, everybody in the Ivorian rainbow, the country of the rainbow nation, is the rainbow of Côte d'Ivoire. Everybody wants a reconciliation, but Mr. Ouattara. And that's the main issue for Côte d'Ivoire tomorrow.
All right, so you said that Mr. Gbagbo is at the center of this reconciliation story. What does he bring to the table that he's able to bring this reconciliation to Côte d'Ivoire?
His own story, his own politics. He's a father of multipartism. He's a guy who he said every time, I am the child of elections. Mr. Gbagbo is seeking only by election. And all the Ivorians know that today. You know, when Mr. Gbagbo was put in jail, people said that Mr. Ouattara was defending the right of the people of the north of the country, mainly in brackets Muslims. 1 year after his inauguration, people of the north, in the language of the north, in Bambara, they said Gbagbo Kafisa. That means in English, Gbagbo was better. That's it.
And it was a very divided country. I mean, civil war, and people lost their lives. Many went into diaspora. They were displaced. A lot of people are looking at Côte d'Ivoire now and saying that it has gone through a prosperous period under the current president. How do you reconcile that? We're not seeing war. It's a country at peace and seems to be prospering.
As I know that a journalist from BBC who said one time, Côte d'Ivoire is like a volcano. You look at the volcano, we don't know when it will burst out. Côte d'Ivoire is a volcano today, you know. And you talk about prosperity, growth rate, etc. But what is growing the first is the desperation of population, the poverty of population. And if Mr. Ouattara is building bridges, you cannot eat a bridge. And Ivorians want to eat before everything.
So, Mr. Gbagbo, do you see him as president in the future?
I hope so. It depends on him. But we will see what he wants to do. But we need him definitely for the reconciliation.
All right, and that reconciliation would include Mr. Ouattara?
If he wants to stay on the table. You know, the mantra of Mr. Gbagbo is sit down and talk. Mr. Gbagbo knows Mr. Ouattara since many years, decades. And tomorrow, if Mr. Ouattara wants to sit and to discuss the future of the country, he can sit with everybody.
Does Mr. Gbagbo feel that he was let down perhaps by ECOWAS, for example?
I think, you know, ECOWAS, they did a game because the game was played by France and even somewhere the US. But by themselves, I know some people from country like Ghana or other country aside of Côte d'Ivoire who were for Gbagbo. And the population of Western Africa, they know Gbagbo as an icon. It's very iconic today. And I am in South Africa, and I can say, to give you a figure, that Mr. Gbagbo is like a Mandela for Western Africa.
All right, well, we'll leave it there, and perhaps the next conversation we have with you might be with Mr. Gbagbo sitting next to you.
God bless us.
Thanks so much indeed for joining us.
You.
Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right.